Greetings and welcome to the Act React podcast. I'm Daniel Burkholder, a dance artist based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi peoples. And I'm the host of this podcast. In this episode, I talk with Cooper Albright, a dance scholar, teacher, choreographer, performer, and of course, improviser. In the spring of 2025, I had the pleasure of hosting Anne here at UW-Milwaukee for a residency in which she taught classes and did a performance reading of her latest book, Simone Forti, Improvising a Life. It was so delightful to have Anne on campus for a couple of days and share her knowledge, wisdom, and really her just overall brilliance with our students who they really enjoyed and were inspired by her teaching and performing. So I was thrilled to have this conversation with Anne after her residency to dig in a little deeper to her artistic practice and how improvisation really informs all that she does. If you don't know Anne, here's some information about her. A dancer, scholar, and a 2019-2020 John Simon Memorial Guggenheim Fellow, Anne Cooper Albright is a professor and chair of the Department of Dance at Oberlin College. Originally an undergraduate philosophy major at Bryn Mawr College, she earned an MFA in dance at Temple University and a PhD in performance studies at New York University. Her latest book is entitled Simone Forti, Improvising a Life. Some of her other books include How to Land, Finding Ground in an Unstable World, which offers ways of thinking about and dealing with the uncertainty of our contemporary life. Engaging Bodies, The Politics and Poetics of Corporeality, and Choreographing Difference, The Body and Identity in Contemporary Dance. She's also the co-editor with Anne Dills of Moving History, Dancing Cultures, and with David Gear of Taken by Surprise, Improvisation in Dance and Mind. Albright is the founder and director of Girls in Motion, an award-winning after-school program at Oberlin's Langston Middle School, and is co-director of Accelerated Motion Towards a New Dance Literacy in America, an NEA-supported website that facilitates active learning and the exchange of teaching strategies and resources to support educators who teach dance studies as a humanistic discipline. Anne is also a veteran practitioner of contact improvisation, has taught workshops internationally, and facilitated Critical Mass CI at 50. The book, Encounters with Contact Improvisation, is the product of one of her adventures in writing and dancing and writing with others, as is the collection Resistance and Support, Contact Improvisation at 50. Her work has been supported by the NEA, the NEH, the NCLS, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Jerome Foundation, and the Ohio Arts Council. Please enjoy my conversation with Anne. Hi, Anne. Thanks so much for joining me on this podcast today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
I'm really excited to talk with you about improvisation and your art practice and your making and performing and teaching, and just kind of dig into how improvisation kind of shows up in your life. So I kind of have a standard question I ask everyone to start with, and that question is, how does improvisation show up in your life these days?
So I was thinking about this when I was traveling in Georgia. Because when you're traveling in a radically different country, you really have to rely on those kind of experiences of curiosity. And also, I think improvisation is a very generous practice. It's a practice that kind of asks you to really extend out into the world. I mean, for me, I wrote an essay once called Life Practices. And I do think that improvisation and the people I've studied with who are improvisers really regard it as a life practice. So there was this one time we did a farm stay in Georgia, and we show up and they take one look at our car and they go, oh, okay, well, we'll have to drive you over there because that car is never going to make it. And so, we go in this kind of like rickety old bridge and off-road, with these kind of steep slopes. And I'm like, breathe in. But then when this woman, and I think that in Georgia, it was a culture where people don't really have a lot of white hair. Most people dye their hair until they're like 90 or something, And so anyway, so this woman came up to me And she was just enthralled with me. Like she touched my hair and she kept like, like the grandmother, my cheeks. And she, said, I didn't speak Georgian, but through my husband who was translating said in Russian, like, she has a good soul. And she just like kept wanting to like touch me. And she just immediately became kind of connected in a way that I think for some people would be really off-putting. And yet I was open to it and like willing to accept that. And I thought to myself, I can do this because of my contact practice. And it wasn't just the physical touch, but it was being open to a different kind of exchange than the normal, I've bought on booking.com a room in this farm stay kind of thing. And so the whole thing was just very much more engaged as a relationship. And I think that improvisation kind of does that. I mean, when I've been teaching last semester, I taught a course called Improvisation in Dance and Mind. And so a lot of, the kind of somatic skills and the mindfulness skills that I teach in an improvisational situation are also, I think, really important for my writing practice as well. So improvisation as a performative practice, as a way of being in the world, but for me, it extends to my writing. And that there are ways in which I think it's important to kind of open up unexpected information or ideas. And I always talk about how oftentimes for me, I think I feel ideas in like the back of my head before they become visible or knowable to me. And that willingness to be patient with that space of kind of unknowing, that space where things are ambiguous or things are kind of unclear, but it's a space that also allows for really fruitful, imaginative thinking as well. But you have to learn how to be patient with that space, how to kind of, Nancy Stark Smith used to talk about not necessarily going with the first impulse, but waiting for the second impulse. But that doesn't mean you don't wait, you don't kind of go with an impulse, but you start to recognize which is a more habitual or automatic response and which one allows for a new way of approaching an experience or a situation. The other thing I think improvisation as a life practice does is it helps us, and of course, I address this in How to Land, Finding Ground in an Unstable World, but I think it kind of helps us deal with this world. And, kind of this spring when everything was being, shut down and getting rid of and, all of the Doge things going on, um, and just opening up the news and, oh, now we're in the middle of a Middle Eastern war. Um, I started to have this practice of, like in yoga, you breathe in, you breathe out, in Buddhist practice, you're kind of aware. And I just was like, okay, how do I stay open to the world here? So I started this practice of breathe in with curiosity and breathe out with generosity. And that became like my mantra this whole spring into the summer of like, how can I breathe in and feel that little tingling sense of possibility and curiosity? And then how can I breathe out and kind of, contain myself in this way that is very open and generous? And I'm 65, and I think that I'm like have this kind of crazy summer of teaching and traveling and different things. And I think that improvisation kind of helps me move into my status as an elder in the field in a way that is very alive and vital rather than kind of shutting down. So I'm excited about that. And yeah, there's pretty much very few times where I don't think to myself, "Thank God I'm an improviser."
That was great. That was great and very kind of like held a lot. And the thing that I would like maybe if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship, and this seemed to like maybe touch on lots of things you said, is this role of improvisation and curiosity, and how does curiosity feed the improvisational practice, and how does improvisation kind of feed your curiosity?
So, I give students kind of little mantras oftentimes, and this mantra came originally from Nancy Stark Smith, although I think I kind of made more of it than she did. You know how sometimes that happens where you pick up on something and you develop it in a way that when it comes back around, they're like, well, I don't remember saying that, kind of thing. But but this idea of that you replace ambition with curiosity, and that's particularly useful in a contact duet once people are pretty good at contact, because it's easy to go into that kind of automatic contact, um, rolling and lifting and supporting without actually taking the time or being interested in, okay, so where is this going now, as opposed to where did this go, 3 minutes ago? Where did this go when we did this last time? Um, and holding that, I think that other thing about curiosity, so I don't know if you're aware, but it is very hot and very humid in Ohio. We're in that like really heat kind of wave. And we're driving to Philadelphia today, which is also like the hottest part in America right now. Um, but I was coming back. I've only been in town for 4 days, but I really wanted to dance, so I called a jam, for some of the people in town yesterday, and in Warner, Maine, it's very hot. We don't have air conditioning, so it's very hot, it's very humid. We have one of those big old fans that you can plug in and really blow some air. But I think that, you know, given that I'm only at home for 4 days between 2, like, over month-long trips, given that I'm 65 years old, given that it's hot and humid, a normal person would not have called a jam, um, because, it's sticky, the floor's sticky, like everything. But I did, and I think that, kind of coming into that space and just thinking like, whoever shows up, shows up. I wrote in my email, like, show up, that's great. If you don't, I'll dance with the ghosts in Warner, Maine. But just that sense of like willingness to kind of put yourself out there and to be curious about what might happen. And yeah, it's not going to be a lot of smooth rolling, sliding kind of thing, but there is something about the sticky that created slightly different conditions to pay attention. I think curiosity is very much related to, paying attention to what is there rather than having an intention to do something. So that intention sometimes in improvisation can kind of, I mean, sometimes it's useful, but sometimes it can kind of lead you in a direction that you don't pay attention to the other things that are happening in the space. But if you have attention and curiosity, I think it is a very productive um, energy to be in. And to keep that curiosity going, even though the world's falling apart, is, I think, um, it's difficult. The students, a couple students were there yesterday who just graduated and are in town making some money before they go off and, do whatever else they do. And I said, how's it feel? And they both were like, it's scary. It's really hard. They both from New York City, so they're looking at the mayor race really closely and, those kinds of things. But I think that the options, for me at least, are, like either you kind of allow yourself to become numb, and kind of withdraw, or you're constantly saying to yourself, oh, like, how can we do this differently? How can I respond differently? What's my curiosity here in a way that is not, how do I want to say this? I think sometimes people think of curiosity as a very passive, like, I'm curious, I'm curious, I'm curious, but like there's no momentum behind it, I guess is what I'm thinking of. And I think curiosity can have direction and it can have momentum and it can have production. It doesn't have to be static or kind of so open you don't go in any direction. But at the same time, it keeps um, allowing for a kind of change in direction or a change in experience.
Great. You started talking about contact improvisation, and I know that's been such a central part to your practice. And it's interesting because I did, leading up to this conversation, I read the article Life Practices or the chapter. That was one of the things that I went back and reread. And in that, I think it's from this, you mentioned that contact improvisation cultivates an openness and curiosity in the midst of chaos, disorientation, and the inevitable experience of falling. And so I'm curious about what kind of brought you to contact improvisation, and why have you kept it as such a central part of your practice?
Yeah. So that's an important piece of history, I think, because it's a little different. I never took a dance class before I got to college. So I didn't grow up dancing at all. I mean, I was a club dancer and I was a punk rocker. Um, but I never actually did a class where you had to think about, the right foot goes one place, the left foot goes another place. Um, and yet I loved kind of movement. I loved the expressivity of movement. I loved a certain kind of athleticness. I love feeling strong as well as flow and grace. Um, but my first experiences were with a Graham teacher. And when we performed in dresses. And I just was like, no, this is not me. I can't do this. I don't know. Mm-mm. Um, and and so because I wasn't kind of trained as a dancer, I think that I didn't feel super comfortable. Like I did some solos in college, but I just feel as if the kind of task-based work of contact, the kind of following that point of contact with another person, the skills involved with it that had a slightly martial tinge to it, that immediately felt like a place where I could grow, but I didn't have to be self-conscious. And I think without kind of growing up as like, look, mom, here I am doing my jazz, kind of thing, I was maybe more self-conscious about moving or, as a beginner mover that, was trying to get technique and all those other things in my system quickly. So when I found contact, I just felt like it allowed for such a huge range of physical possibilities. You can be like super delicate and the touch can be very light and you could be super sensitive, or you can just like be throwing someone around. Like you can really, it was for me to be able to like put my weight somewhere, to lose all of my weight in one direction, whether it was lifting someone up on my shoulder or that kind of sense of resistance, just fed a physical experience that was wonderful for me. And it feels like it connects with, I talk to the students because the only door that requires a certain amount of pressure is this old door on the library, but the students just push the automatic door thing all the time. And I'm like, no, wait, like there's this nice moment. You go into it and it resists, and then you use your weight and you push through. But, there are very few experiences now in our lives that require people to really use their weight against something, like pushing the car when the car is stalled or something like that, or getting the cow over to the right place for milking or something like that. You just don't do that very often. Um, and so I appreciated that about contact. And then when I was in my mid 30s, when I had my second child, I had these really severe back injuries into the spinal cord. And so the work in contact with mixed ability dancing, which I had already kind of thought about and experienced in jams and in kind of um, danceability workshops, that kind of came home when I started having my own ability issues. And then knowing that contact was a space that allowed for a body to change and you could still dance, um, was super, super important. Because, when I was going to the doctors and, they were like, well, you might have to retire from dancing. I was like, what the hell? I'm 34, like I'm not going to retire from dancing. But I think that also the kind of patience of improvisation, and the somatic work, I did a lot of BMC work, which fed into that too. But that sense of, okay, like, what is it like to lift my head? How can I lift my head in a way when I'm lying prone that doesn't hurt my back? Like how do I kind of um find something interesting in a very subtle way, like the equivalent of the stand, but just like lifting up a little bit or just using, I did a lot of crawling. I was crawling, with my baby on the floor kind of thing. So I think that the the form itself has really opened up the possibility of me going and keeping going. And so, then I had some joint replacement stuff 5 years ago, and it was like, but I can come back and still dance. But I can, and I think that open mindset as well as the physical practices that kind of allow me to just go back into, what I call shrimp starfish, open and close, crawl, like all of those things so that if you're injured, there's something to kind of fall back on and to start to kind of recover with that. So for me, it's just been a like super juicy, juicy form. And I guess in terms of now, I feel as if I'm pretty focused on building a literacy around it because it was just heartbreaking that Contact Quarterly stopped when Nancy died. And I think that it didn't have to be that way, and it's sad that it was that way. But now I really want to be like, okay, people, there's got to be something past, like Sharing the Dance is a great book, but it was published in 1990. You know what I mean? Like we need to like keep going here, people. So creating situations like CI 50, creating little study units or finding ways to get people's words out there, I think is now really important for me. Writing about my own practice is starting to become um, more interesting to me than it ever was. I've not done a ton. I mean, I've never done like a book on contact so far. Resistance and Support, the collection of essays I did, Taken by Surprise. I've written about stuff in different ways, but now I really feel like, okay, I want to get more material out there.
So for with oh, I just had a thought and then just slipped out of my head. But the kind of importance of, as you were talking about, the importance of contact improvisation, your own practice, and then also this last thing about continuing a writing practice around contact improvisation, both for yourself and encouraging and supporting and mentoring others. What what's that connection between, you already mentioned it a little bit earlier about your writing practice inspired or at writing as an improvisational practice. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that or how these things kind of overlap or bleed together?
Sure. I mean, I think, okay. I mean, I would say that this term literacy is really important to me, that people in dance, I feel as if in so many other art forms, that, people know the history of music, they know the history of jazz, they know, the history of art, if they're going to be artists, musicians, improvisers with music or whatever. But in dance, we really have this kind of way in which we're working so hard to be present, that we spend so much time in the studio. We, kind of cultivate technique and practices and choreography and performances, that it seems hard to also incorporate literacy, to like know the history, to really think about ideas. What are the ideas implicated in this form? And I think that of many different kinds of dance forms, contemporary improvisation is even further away from literacy. Lots of people show up to contact jams, lots of people do contact in a way that doesn't really need to, or it doesn't seem to need to acknowledge that, this was a form that started a certain place, came out of a cultural context that, kind of continued in these different ways. And I feel as if that's unfortunate, because I think that writing and literacy and ideas implicated in forms of dance are ways to give dance more value, that people oftentimes, dance is like the handmaiden of all the arts. When you look at where that money goes, dance is bottom, bottom, bottom. And most people don't know how to talk about it, dance. I mean, the, average teenager can talk about jump cuts, film, video, all kinds of stuff with incredible precision and nuance. But people see movement and they're like, "Oh, that was great. Yeah, super excited. Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's amazing." And you're like, "Yeah, but what does it mean? Like, but what? Like what was amazing about it? Like what was compelling to you? How do you connect with it?" And people just don't want to talk about it, and I think that comes from a lot of times people go to dance because they want to be nonverbal and, all kinds of things. But I don't want to kind of allow for that separation of ideas and verbal and literacy and writing from a practice that I find very meaningful. So for me, the improvisation within the writing has to do with acknowledging that there is this kind of really interesting process of thinking, ideas that don't necessarily look like, technique. Like improvisation has skills and it has techniques, but they don't look like the skills and the technique you're used to seeing. And in that, I think is super, like for me, that's super interesting. And I want to try to articulate what are those skills? What is the kind of ways in which improvisation teaches certain ways of thinking, ways of moving, and not in order to standardize it. Like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of contact recently is that the fear or the sense of like, we didn't standardize it. We were going to sign this thing to be able to copyright or patent it. We didn't, because like it's just going to be out there. That kind of ideology or mythos, I mean, I think it's a myth now in some ways, kind of has pulled people away from really articulating a kind of what is contact pedagogy. Again, to articulate it not in order to standardize it, but to articulate it to kind of come to understand. I mean, if you don't try to use language or write about something, there's a whole aspect of it that continues to be just off in the clouds. And I think that particularly now, a lot of people are coming back to contact and coming to contact for the first time. I think it's offering incredible, solace for people who have felt very isolated or alienated. But at the same time, we need to be articulate about what that stuff is. What is the connection between, this is my new thing now, is this sense of somatic awareness, physical skills, and improvisational mindset. And it kind of lines up with this responsiveness, resistance, and resilience. Like, how did those 3 R's that I articulated in How to Land also become implicated in what I think are these three, kind of Venn diagram circles that are important to teaching contact.
So that may be a nice segue in, because one thing I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about is, how do you and how does one, I guess, teach improvisation, both maybe contact improvisation, but then also contemporary improvisation. Of course, those are a Venn diagram as well, right? Of where they overlap. And like, because you work with college students all the time. I also know you work with other age students as well. But how do you bring them to that improvisational mindset? And what are those skills or practices that you find potent and productive and
Yeah.
useful?
I think, particularly at the level of college, but, for instance, I've just been thinking, I'm going to the Dance Studies Association conference in DC. I'm actually getting an award.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I'm doing a session for the Practices Research Hub and or working group, I guess. And I was thinking about it like, okay, so I asked about this space, it's going to be one of those concrete block rooms with, kind of movable chairs in it or something like that. I was like, okay, how do I work with this space? How do I start to approach some of the things I want to do? And I realized somewhere, on the like 9th hour of a 12-hour flight from Istanbul to JFK, that I really needed to start with bodily awareness, like a somatic awareness. Like, even though I only have 40 minutes and I want to do some stuff with writing and moving and things, I'm like, well, actually, I really need to start with, kind of close your eyes, the stand or moving or something. So I think that improvisationally, it's really important to start with that cultivation of somatic awareness. You need to be able to just be in a space and feel your body before you tell it what to do, before you get involved in kind of more elaborate scores, before, so that sense of, I think I probably did it when I was in Milwaukee as well, walking through the room, starting to be aware of 3 dimensions, starting to be aware of your pelvis and moving, like all of those things, people in this space. I think those are really important awarenesses to kind of start to cultivate so that you can open up. Like, and I have very specific, kind of, what do I want to say? Very specific, like, I think relaxing the eyes and using the eyes through, so that you have more peripheral vision is a way to cultivate an improvisational mindset. I think, opening the backspace, becoming aware of sound and not just vision, thinking of gravity, all the things we do, I think are ways to help people move past their training very often into an ability to start to become responsive to other things. So I think that kind of mindfulness, can you just be with your own body? Authentic movement, for instance, just awareness of breathing. I mean, it's funny because that, of course, is very much part of the early modern pedagogy, right? Is like the breath, you open up with the breath, those kinds of things. And nowadays people are, particularly students who come out of some kind of competition dance or something, it's like 5, 6, 7, 8, and hit it, kind of thing. So having them just be there is really scary sometimes, so kind of finding ways to cultivate that, to break through that. But it also is a way to train many different kinds of bodies into their own curiosity so that, they don't feel as if, when you train that way in a class for the first several sessions, then nobody feels like I can't do this form. It's kind of bringing an awareness that I think is very much available. They may feel awkward in it. They may have, I had a student who, in the fall when I was teaching contact, had like incredible skills, interested in choreography, but every single like aspect of her body was tight. It was like tight emotionally, tight physically. Her jaw is set, it's just really striking to me how even after, several months, it was hard for her. And what kind of felt for her like huge release wasn't necessarily visible from the outside. But I think that, so for me, the actual physical skills and the mindfulness skills are what leads to an improvisational mindset. But as I said before, I think recognizing that as you go along and being transparent about that helps students understand that you're actually teaching a certain way of being, a certain kind of technique for that. And so I try to tell students like this is connected to this, which is connected to this, both in terms of, physical skills, but also in terms of kind of emotional and mental connections or leaps or navigation.
So just maybe drilling down a little bit more, what are some like maybe foundational or specific kind of structures or exercises that you would do with students to kind of move them? You've already mentioned some, of course, around mindfulness and awareness and that stuff, but kind of those next steps of being ready to, I don't know, and maybe this is a question, is like when you're teaching improvisation, do you have a sense of that you're training them to be in a jam, training them to perform, training them to apply the improvisation into different contexts? Is there that kind of frames that you use, or is it more open?
I think, I teach very different classes. All right. So,
Yeah.
when I'm teaching a contact class, I'm teaching them, the kind of base skills of contact. But in order to do that, I do a lot of somatic work as well, a lot of BMC work. I do that kind of navel radiation. I do, crawling on all fours and then release, but then the, head to spine, like energy. I have, what I call roll ups. So like you shoot your legs to the air and then the head, I do a lot of stuff of like head down, tail up, tail down, head up. So, claws and wings. A lot of teachers teach these and I just, because I've been teaching for so long, I have like little codes, that I use. But I teach, like, for instance, I teach a course called Physical Mindfulness, which is, attracts, it's a beginning course. It attracts a lot of the Conservatory of Music students. And that really is, kind of drawing on yoga, somatic work, authentic. Then, I teach a course called Somatic Landscapes, which is cross-listed with environmental studies. So that's a course that uses the systems of BMC and aligns them with the states in the world, like earth, water, air, fire. And how do we kind of think of our body as a landscape? And then in the second half of the semester, I teach that course in the spring. And the second half of the semester, we do work where they go and put their bodies in a landscape and kind of dance within that and understand that not so much just as like an open improvisation, I can dance with the clouds, but actually understanding the relationship of earth, water, air, fire in their bodies. And then I teach a course called Varsity Contact, which oftentimes is a performance course where we may create performances, or we host 12-hour jams, or we do something that kind of takes our contact practice and engages with a larger world. And then I teach this course I taught in the spring, which is Improvisation and Dance in Mind, in which we use Taken by Surprise, and we kind of look at a lot of different improvisational approaches, kind of across different cultures, across different time frames. And then they come up with their own, not just their own scores, but also what are the ways that you need to prepare bodies for the kind of score you want to do? Is it a vocal score? That's a class where I do a lot of work with talking and moving together. Well, a lot of work. I kind of, students are pretty resistant to that, but I kind of try to cultivate that as well in that class. So the classes are all like they're all slightly tweaked, but I may use some of the same, I'll probably do a stand in almost all of those classes. I probably will teach claws and wings in almost all of those classes. Claws and wings for me is expanding the energetic profile that you have. Like a lot of people have a pretty limited energetic profile. They're like comfortable in a certain range of motion or a certain range of energy. And I try to really expand those, and claws and wings is one way to do that. But I would say throughout all of, like you talked a little bit earlier about a teacher, I know, so a good friend of mine is a Graham teacher. And I mean, she like danced with Graham, and she, she taught for many, many years at Barnard, and she sits in a chair, like wide, kind of thing. And that's how she teaches, which to me, sorry, to me is like, wow, that's different, like, because if I send people moving through the space, I'm moving through the space with them. I teach from inside the kinds of exercises I'm having students do, so I can understand the vibe of the room from inside, not from watching outside. So I think that that's also kind of, so there are some things that are consistent, even though the different courses target slightly different facets of an improvisational practice.
I remember when I was in grad school getting my MA at American University, we were in actually a pedagogy class, and the teacher said, "Okay, everyone, make a phrase that we're then going to use for this assignment in pedagogy." And someone who became a very close friend of mine, he walked over. He actually was in the Graham Company as well, and mostly taught ballet. He walked over and wrote down the phrase. And of course, I'm up like trying to figure out what to do. And I was like, "You just wrote it down?" He's like, "Yep, here it is." Like he never did it. He just like was able to write it down and stuff like that. And I was like, that's like such a different mindset and how to
Right,
approach that kind
right.
of thing,
I mean, and that's, if there is a technique that is codified enough that there's a vocabulary, you can say pas de bourrée, pas de chat, la 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 la, and you don't have to do it. You can just tell them what to do, or you might, kind of signal with your hands. But most of the work I've been involved in doesn't have that kind of vocabulary.
Yeah.
Even though I think, I think it is really useful to be super articulate when you're a teacher. Like finding ways to articulate the nuances between, kind of as I was mentioning earlier, like an openness and a curiosity that just is like static because you're so curious that you can't like figure out any desire to go somewhere, you know? So kind of articulating things that allow students to think about how do you have an open intention and still recognize your own desires? That's the really interesting conundrum in contact or in improvisation, you know? So like where are those? For me, that's very um very interesting. Like I could talk about that for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. When you were here in Milwaukee earlier this spring, you taught classes to our students as we've talked about, and they were so taken with your teaching and with you. But you also had a chance to perform and offer a performance. So I'm curious, like all these ideas we've talked about, we haven't really talked about you performing. And I'm curious about how you approach performing, now with the work that you're doing or previously, or like, so how does improvisation show up in your creative work and your performance work?
Yeah, so I would say that it kind of depends on the project in some ways. But what I did at Milwaukee, which I've been doing around is this work with the Simone book that I wrote. And what I love about that, and I'm finding it really interesting, is that, I kind of wrote that book with a real awareness of my own physical experience, both watching as well as doing Simone's work. But at the same time, the ideas in the chapters led me into a lot of different places, and then to finish the book and then kind of bring it back into my body and to play with both, kind of performing and reading, and that exchange back and forth between language and actually enacting things with my body is super fun, and also because I'm talking as I'm performing. So I think that's something that is very fruitful for me right now because it's something I can do without feeling like sometimes when I perform contact, last spring, I did a duet with a former student. And it was great. And everybody, I mean, I got so many people in my contact class the next fall because people were like, whoa, that's a dance form I can keep doing, like that's great, kind of thing. But at the same time, I will say that when I'm performing contact, there is like a little bit of pressure that I put on myself and maybe some stress around being physically capable. Can I get on someone's shoulder still? Can I get somebody on my shoulder? Kind of what does it mean? Because when you perform, I talk a lot about when I have, say, a varsity contact class, how do you show an audience very quickly what the priorities are? This particular score or in this particular improvisation. And in contact, it's really about, the priorities are a kind of nuance in touch. So you have to display that before you start, doing a lot of acrobatic work kind of thing. Um, how do you get an audience to start to become responsive to their own bodies as they watch your body? Um, so I think that the question for me, so something like the Simone work, that feels very generative right now for me. The question for me is, what do I do with contact? I'm starting to work on, not next spring, but in the spring of 2027, I'm going to do ODC, which is our Oberlin Dance Company. I'm going to do a full concert, and I think it's like my, you know, kind of retirement concert, even though I'm not sure I'm going to retire, but it's like the big thing. And it's called Feeling Backwards, a retrospective in motion. And so I will have a varsity contact class. I will have them, but the question is, do I perform with them or not? Do I do, a duet or not? These are the things I'm kind of trying to feel out a little bit for myself. I have, like there are times when I've tweaked something a little bit. This spring I tweaked, it was great. Like I was performing and doing a lot of stuff and it was fabulous. And then like 3 weeks later when I was at Oberlin, I tweaked my left knee a little bit and it required, some like pull back and, PT and things like that. So it's a question for me of like, how much can I be like, yeah, here I am 65, but I'm still strong and I can still do it, or how much do I kind of say, okay, maybe I find a way to do this differently. I mean, I'm going to WikiJam. I'm teaching in Philly an intensive, and I'm going to WikiJam this year. And so, and the theme for WikiJam this year is longevity of practice. So they're kind of honoring, and for me, like it is, I suddenly realized when I guess maybe I turned 65 or something, or it's all kind of coming down, but I'm like, "Oh, I get it. I'm an elder now." Like, "Oh, that's why people are," they're like, "Oh, we're honored to have you here," like kinda thing. And I'm like, "Wait, what?" You But, kind of so part of that is, figuring out where I wanna place my body, how much I can do, how much I just have to be careful so I'm not constantly injuring myself, or do I like, there's still part of me is like, I'm just going to get really strong. That's what I'm going to do. But of course, how much time do you have to like work out every day kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. But the Simone work, the work with like language and movement, that feels like something I can do a lot. And I like doing. I like playing with kind of words and images and movement and having some things be very like, here's a narrative story, and other things being a little bit more mysterious and not really making the connections for people, but just having them there. So, yeah.
Right. As you were talking, I just had this image of this young punk rocker transforming into this respected elder over the time in it. So, Anne, thanks so much for taking this time and talking with me about improvisation and what you do in the world. And it's been lovely to kind of this spring to meet you and get to dance with you some and get to know you a little bit. It's been a real honor to have that happen. And it's been great to have you as part of my podcast. Part of what I've realized that this podcast it's becoming like an archive of improvisational practices. And I'm really thinking about how do I make sure I able to represent a huge range of people and experiences and to kind of gather all these ideas about what improvisation is and how it is in the world. So
Well,
I'm excited to have your voice as part of that archive.
it was a pleasure. As I said before, it was a pleasure to get to know you and your colleagues and your students. Yeah, I feel the same way. But I think that what we've just done is in some ways contact, like you make physical contact, you make intellectual contact, you make energetic contact, you have that exchange, and it can lead to other kinds of exchanges, and just being available for that without, kind of it having to fit a certain slot, is great. And that for me, like at my age, that's what keeps me going. Like, yeah, this can be a whole new place for me to kind of engage, and that's fun.
Well, thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too. See you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Anne and gained insight into artistic and scholarly practice and maybe a little inspired in your own work. I know I want to work to link my writing and my dancing, my performing, my improvising, like figure out how to weave that together in a more integrated manner. Episodes of Act Your Act come out every other Thursday. So the next episode drops on September 4th, and that'll be my conversation with Ishmael Houston Jones. Another really inspiring and insightful conversation. Ishmael offers lots of great perspective on improvisation, contact improvisation, and just being an artist in today's world. So please check that out. In the meantime, please follow us on social media. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok, and we've got the Act React profile on FaceTime and YouTube. So we'll be dropping video excerpts from previous conversations and previous seasons, as well as some kind of fun, inspiring quotes that have been pulled out of those conversations. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for those. In addition, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on YouTube. The more subscribers we have, the more people we can reach. So appreciate that. I look forward to sharing more episodes as the season continues. And until then, live spontaneously.